So the author of Revelation, there's not a lot of argument. Generally, everyone agrees it is John the Apostle. He identifies himself as John in the text. Some people have argued that it's not John the Apostle, but possibly a different John. There's a John in history called John the Elder. They speculated it might be him because he doesn't actually identify himself as John the Apostle or disciple or any of that. He just calls himself a prophet in the text. But early external church history from the early 100s, Irenaeus, who was the disciple of Polycarp, and Polycarp was the disciple of John, so we're talking like 2 steps away from John, said that John the Apostle wrote it. So we pretty much agree, and many other church fathers echoed that idea. So we pretty much are universally agree that John the Apostle wrote the Revelation, the book of Revelation. Also, it's revelation of Jesus Christ, as it says in the beginning, not revelations. There's not multiple revelations, it's just one. So he has just throwing that out there. Take that for what you will. All right. So John the Apostle. Some kind of context. Dating the book can be interesting. There's kind of 2 arguments, either somewhere in the mid-90s AD or in the mid-60s AD. Generally, the mid-90s AD answer is the most kind of supported. That's also the date that Irenaeus gave to it, so that gives a lot of credit to that idea. Internal evidence points to a time of heavy persecution. We know that John is on Patmos when he has this vision, which is in kind of a desolate island off the coast of Asia Minor, somewhat close to Ephesus. So this kind of heavy persecution that he mentions in the beginning, the 2 main places that probably was 60s AD or 90s AD. One under Nero in the 60s, because that's when Paul and Peter and all those guys get martyred. And then later on in the century, we have Domitian, the emperor, and he also persecuted the church very heavily. So it could be one of those. But generally, the 90s is the better supported. The way he talks about the temple, the way he talks about Rome and its connection to Babylon, the way the outside external evidence all points to that. So that's generally what we think, mid-90s. And it makes more sense, too, if we know John went to Ephesus, we know he has a history there, and Patmos is fairly close to there. It makes sense at that time that he might have been, as one of the leaders of the church in that area, he would be kind of exiled at Patmos for that reason. So we know he's more than likely, he says that he's kind of under persecution, and so we assume that he has been exiled to this island. And he has his visions there, and that's more than likely where he wrote the text. The text is addressed to 7 churches of the cities in Asia Minor, kind of all on the western side towards the coast. These are Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. So the 7 churches, all cities kind of in that general area. And he writes this because he was commanded to, right? So he says multiple times in chapter 1 that he was commanded to write to these churches. And kind of the first section we'll see kind of reflects that idea, as there are individual messages for these churches. Genre. The genre of Revelation is pretty interesting. Has several kind of things going on here. First, it is a letter, right? It's an epistle. Right? He's writing to these people. It has the normal kind of Greek letter. It has a greeting at the beginning, it has a closing at the end, and it has a body in the middle, right? So it is a letter, right? It's a direct address type book. But there's a lot of other things obviously going on. They've kind of labeled this as an apocalypse, right? They've created kind of this genre called apocalypse, which is this genre kind of between 200 BC and 200 AD. So for this 400-year period, we have several of these apocalypse type of books. And this genre has specific characteristics and content and function. Generally, apocalypse literature is narrative-based, where a person, like a normal person, is given kind of supernatural revelation from some kind of supernatural being. right? And it speaks of the eventual salvation of a people and a future world, right? So these kind of ideas that we have happening here. So this was something that you would have seen and been somewhat common at the time in kind of Jewish writing and kind of writing in the near Middle East of this apocalypse type of a thing. So God is kind of using this genre to speak to John in this way, and John is using this as well. We see other types of kind of apocalypse appearing. The Olivet Discourse in the Gospels, where Jesus kind of predicts and speaks of the end times, is also considered an apocalypse kind of passages. But this apocalypse genre, is really kind of a smaller chunk of the more broad kind of idea of prophecy, right? This is just kind of a type of prophecy with specific themes and specific forms. Because if you remember back to our talk on prophecy, our definition of prophecy, kind of from a few weeks ago, is that prophecy is a message from God, right? It's a very broad definition, right? It's a message of God through some form of intermediary, right? So someone is giving the words of God to the people. And John's vision here in Revelation is pretty similar to what we see in Ezekiel. If you remember back, Ezekiel has visions, and that's most of what the book is about. And so Ezekiel gives these visions to the people as prophecy. And so here we have John having these visions and him giving it to the churches. So pretty similar idea, pretty similar genre, structure, purpose, all that kind of thing. The apocalypse just has a kind of a more specific content, right? It's talking about end times. It's comparing now versus the coming future and all that sorts of stuff. All right. So, good to remember, because it is prophecy, it is apocalypse, right? We must consider kind of the hallmarks and conventions of the genre. So there's going to be a lot of figurative language, a lot of symbolism in the text happening, and that can be one of the problems with interpreting prophecy in general, right? Trying to identify what's symbolism and what's not, like what's literal and what's a metaphor, right? Some things are literal, some things are not. And so it's important, I think, when looking at it, to not go too far in one direction, right? We don't want to say everything is a symbol, and we don't want to say everything is literal, right? So those are the kind of where we don't want to be. I think somewhere in the middle is usually the better idea. There are actual literal things that he's talking about, and there's actual clear symbols. So thankfully, the text usually explains when it has symbols. It says, and then, we saw the 7 seals on this thing, and then it'll explain, the 7 seals are this, right? Now, sometimes the explanation isn't actually that helpful, so that's less helpful. But at least it's giving us the idea that, hey, this is a symbol, right? And so that can be helpful when we're going through, even if trying to understand it is a little harder sometimes. So I tend to be a little on the more literal side of the scale, but that's just my interpretational method. So as long as you're kind of in the ballpark, I think you're doing all right. So take that for what you will. We're not going to get super deep into it, but that's just a helpful way to be. Okay, let's talk about themes of Revelation. First theme, Jesus, the slain and resurrected Lamb, is coming again as the everlasting King and Judge. Right, so the second coming, that's the big overarching idea. That's the point of the whole thing, right? Jesus is coming again. He's going to be King and Judge. That's it, right? That's the main idea. And then we have kind of 2 other ideas. There's a lot of stuff happening in Revelation, obviously, but kind of the big idea is this good versus evil thing, right? And the different functions, different applications, different situations, and where that is relevant. So idolatry versus right worship is a big deal in Revelation, so correct worship. So good worship versus bad worship is really important. And then the idea of the church versus Babylon, or like the New Jerusalem versus Babylon, or the church versus the world. So these 2 ideas of locations or cities representing kind of like good and evil, right? And so there's a holy war that kind of happens, and there's the second end kind of talks about these 2 ideas in these 2 cities. So this good versus evil is something that's all over the text and kind of a main theme that we see. And this is kind of true with apocalyptic literature in general, this idea of now versus the future and good versus evil and that kind of stuff. So this is pretty standard for the genre. Okay, structure. So there's a lot of ways to talk about the structure of Revelation. So I've given you 3 different ones there, and they kind of increase in complexity, and we're going to go through all of them. But there are a few things that everyone kind of agrees upon, right? We can clearly see there's a prologue right in the beginning, the prologue, and then there's a epilogue at the end. So that's helpful, right? That gives us bookends to go off of. And we can also see there's several interludes or intervals or kind of asides or transitions, whatever you want to call them, in between kind of the narrative passages. So we see all this stuff, and then there's kind of a interlude in between them. So almost all of the structures, you'll see these kind of interludes in between these passages. So that's helpful too, right? So this gives us something to kind of hold on to as we're trying to figure out the structure of what's happening in the book. Okay, so let's look at the outlines. First one is the threefold division. This is very simple, and it's just broken down based on time frame. So in the text, we have delineating between various points in time, beginning with the past and moving to the present and then on to the future. So, and it all kind of hallmarked by these phrases: what you have seen in the past, what is, and then talks about the present, and then what will take place later, and then talking about the future. Right? So this kind of helps us, gives us an idea of where we are in things, because it'll get really complicated, but it's helpful to know, oh, after chapter 4, right, we're talking about future things now. Right? We're not talking about present, we're not talking about past. Now we've kind of moved on to a different time frame. So this is helpful. This can kind of give us a baseline. And this outline, you can kind of put this in with other outlines, right, to just give you a thought process and kind of give you some context. But obviously not the most in-depth of outlines, just 3 things. And so we can move to some other ones. Next we have the 7 series of 7, right? And there are a lot of 7s happening in the text, right? Numerology is usually often somewhat important in prophecy. You can get a little bit too into that, but we won't do that. But there are, numbers do have kind of meaning and significance, and it's kind of helpful to look at those reoccurring ideas. And so we have a lot of 7s happening here in Revelation. Now, the 7 series of 7 is kind of a misnomer, as there are only 4 explicit 7s that we see in the book, right? And these are 7 letters, 7 seals, 7 trumpets, and 7 bowls. But you can kind of get 7 out of the different visions and kind of the New Jerusalem passage. So it's kind of finagled into 7 sevens. So it's a little forced to make it, sound right. But the structure, I think, is even though the name is kind of might not be the best, I think the structure is actually pretty helpful. So first we have a prologue, and then we have the 7 letters to the churches, right? Introduction. And then you talk about the 7 letters to the churches, and then there's this interlude, right? And you'll see these interludes, these transitions between each of these different sections. Then you move on to the 7 seals, which is the various judgments, the first of the various judgments. Then there's an interlude, 7 trumpets, again, various judgments, an interlude. And then there's a series of visions of various things happening in the future, an interlude, and then you get to the 7 bowls, again, judgments, an interlude, visions again, and then we have the New Jerusalem and the epilogue. Okay. So that's kind of just one way we can look at it. And I think this is helpful, right, to kind of make connections between these 7s and see kind of what's happening and how they're connected and how we have these sections and interlude and back and forth between these different episodes. And it's not perfect, obviously. It's not all 7s, but it can be helpful. It's good, right? I think it's a good outline, but it's not my favorite. I just wanted to provide kind of one way to look at it. Next, we have the 4 visions kind of outline. And this, I think, is my favorite. This structure is based on the phrase of "in the Spirit." So oftentimes in Scripture, we'll have kind of signifying phrases which delineate new sections of a text. Right? So every time you see "in the Spirit," we're moving on to this new section. Right? So each time you see "in the Spirit," it starts a new vision, right? A new kind of theme, a new idea, a new vision that John is given in this phrase. So the same, kind of similar idea that we see in Genesis. Right? Genesis is broken down by this toledot, is a phrase in Hebrew. Right? It means the generations of. Right? So every time you see that in Genesis, you're like, oh, this is a new section. Right? The generations of Abraham, and then generations of blah. Right? Same kind of thing here, right? In the Spirit, see the different visions. So first we have our prologue, once again, helpful. And then we have vision 1, Christ and the church. right? And so this is kind of the vision of Christ and the messages to the 7 churches. And this first vision that he has. Similar kind of to the last one. So that's vision 1, the letters to the churches. Next we move to vision 2, the divine court and the trial of nations. So here we have kind of another vision. John is taken away into the throne room, into the court of God. And we see the worship around the throne, the divine courtroom. And we start this series of judgments. Right, we have investigative judgments of the 7 seals and the seal judgments, an interlude. Again, these interludes we see throughout. Then we have another investigative judgment, the 7 trumpets, and the trumpet judgments, another interlude, two interludes. And then finally we have the bowls, investigative judgment of the 7 bowls, right? So all of these judgments happening in the holy divine courtroom and the throne room. So that's all of this second vision, is that divine courtroom kind of idea that we see. Next we have the third vision, destruction of Babylon and return of Christ. So here we kind of have that good versus evil thing happening. We have a description of the prostitute city of Babylon, the trial of Babylon and its destruction, and kind of the celebration over that. And then we have divine warrior and final tribunal, and then the renewal of creation and New Jerusalem. And that leads into vision 4, which is about the New Jerusalem, right? The bride, and it descends from heaven and describing all of that. And then finally, paradise and the renewal of creation. It's kind of this fourth vision and an epilogue. So I think this is the most helpful. And I think this gives us an idea of like, oh, what's actually kind of happening here. And again, this is just structural. There are a lot of other ways some people had a chiastic structure, which is where you have kind of the beginning and the end mirroring each other, and you have sets of mirrors going into the middle, which is usually the highlight. That's a chiastic structure. That could be, I can kind of see where people are coming from that. Normally when people try to apply like chiasms or chiastic structure to stuff, it can be a little forced, right? Because they're just like looking for it. They're like looking for it specifically instead of trying to read out from what the text says. But I can see where people are coming from. I didn't include it because I'm like, I don't know. But that exists also. Some people see it as kind of a drama with like a 2-act structure of a different kind of, like a play happening. So that's another way people have structured it. But there's a lot of different ways you can do it. All right. I'm just going to leave it mostly at that. There are obviously a lot of interpretations, but they're mostly based around 2 things with interpretation. How literal do you want to be with your symbolism, right? What is a symbol and what isn't, right? We kind of talked about that. That's a big kind of area where you fall in that line is going to determine how you interpret Revelation in a lot of ways. And then the second thing is like question of timing, right? So do these judgments happen, do all of the seals opened and then all of the trumpets sound together? So is it sequential in time frame or, chronological as it's written? Or is it kind of not that, right? Is the first seal get broken and then we have the first trumpet and then we have the first bowl, right? Do all the ones happen together and they're kind of like interlaced within each other time frame wise? People have proposed that idea. So timing is another idea of that people kind of separates how you do interpretation. And then you get into like, well, what is the rapture and what is the millennium and what are these things? How do we understand these ideas? And we have historical understandings and then more modern ones. And anyway, we're not going to get into all that. If you're into it, we can talk about it. But we're just trying to kind of give a basic understanding, outline of what's going on. There's judgments happening and there's like renewal happening. That's kind of the main gist, right? Christ is coming again. So, yeah, that's good. That is Revelation. Any questions, thoughts, comments? Okay. Cool. So, at this point in the class, we've done the whole Bible. Congratulations, we made it. So that was cool. We've kind of talked about an introduction to each book and talked about genre and time frame and history and all that sort of stuff. And the reason we kind of decided to do this is to help get a bigger picture of what the Bible is talking about, right? Kind of a wider, more stepped away, higher view of what the text is about. It just kind of helps us give background and context to where we are, right? When you dive into Isaiah, you can be like, oh, this is kind of where this is, where it fits in time and history and in the biblical story. Right? Because the overarching story, narrative, plot structure of the Bible is really important to help us kind of get our feet when we're doing any kind of Bible study. And what we call this, and we talked about this before, is often called the meta-narrative of Scripture, right? Like, what's the overarching story? Not necessarily what's happening in Daniel, right? But what's happening overall, right? What is this meta-narrative? The story beyond the story, right? Beyond, ahead of the story. I like the phrase, the story of redemptive history. I prefer that. I like that one a lot. One of my theology teachers described this kind of meta-narrative or this story of redemptive history with an analogy. He said the Bible is kind of sort of like a jigsaw puzzle, right? And there are a lot of pieces, and we're trying to fit it all together and make it make sense, right? And get it in the right way so we can see the picture of what it has to say. And so the meta-narrative, or the overarching story, kind of acts as the top of the box of a jigsaw puzzle, right? It kind of gives us an idea of what it's supposed to look like. And so helping to understand that really helps us put these pieces together when we get in the nitty-gritty. Right? It's like, oh, well, what is happening in the overarching story? It's like, oh, we're in Genesis. Okay, so this is the beginning. So this is something I can, when I'm putting these Genesis pieces together, where I can understand kind of where it fits with the rest of everything else. Because the Bible really is one story, right? History has one story. It's God's relationship with us. And it has all these parts that a story needs to be a story, right? It all kind of flows together. And I think actually, I would argue that all stories kind of conform to the story of Scripture, right? Because it is the one story. But that's a philosophical thing I could rant about later. But it is one story. And through the cross, I hope we've kind of seen this all kind of come together a little bit. Even though we have gone a little bit in depth on each individual book, I do want to kind of take it back a little bit. Because as we work through in the various sections, the various books, we can see the overarching plot and narrative. Right, we have the Pentateuch, which is our introduction, like any story, right? It gives you characters, God and man and Satan, right? The main characters that you're going to have through this whole book. And it gives you a setting, right? It actually creates the setting, right? The heavens and the earth are created, and this is where it's going to take place. And it gives us the conflict, right? Or the inciting incident, if you remember from school, right? Which is the fall, sin, right? This is the conflict, right? So there's conflict happening here. There's a problem. And so that's all you need to set up and start a story, right there in the Pentateuch. And then you have all the Old Testament. And this is kind of like that rising action in the story, right? There's ups and downs that extends the conflict and extends kind of the solution to that conflict. We have foreshadowing of what's to come. We have escalation. So in the histories and the prophets and the writings and the poetry and all that stuff, we see different aspects of this kind of rising action. We see Israel and man fail over and over and over, and God give grace over and over and over, right? So this constantly up and down nature of the story. And we get it in different ways. We get it overarching from nation view, or we get it in the life of David, right? And his failures and his ups and downs. Or we get it from God speaking to us directly and his heart and his character, right? And we see God working throughout all of these things, from Abraham and Adam to Moses and David, all the way through, we see God working to achieve his promises, right? So we have this rising action kind of idea that we don't always have in stories. And then finally, we have the climax, and the climax of all of history, right, in the Gospels, right? God becomes man and dies upon the cross and resurrected and all of that stuff. So the prophecy of Genesis 3, right, and all the prophecies in the Old Testament are kind of fulfilled in this time frame. And so this is our climax, right? The King has come. God with us has come, and he's here, and he's died in resurrection for us. All right, so the climax of the story. And then we have kind of the New Testament, which acts as kind of that resolution, right? It kind of gives us that falling action. We have how we are now different, right? Things are different in a story, right? You have kind of all the conflict, climax, and then it's different now. Something's changed, right? And so we're different, and we're changed, and the paradigm is different than it was. And so we have this kind of falling action and this fallout and repercussions of what has happened at the cross. And God is still working, right? And we see that. And finally, we get to the ending, and that's where we are today, right? Eschatology, which is often what we call this Revelations and Apocalypse, is a word that just means study of the end. Because eschaton in Greek just means the end or the last, and so study of the end, so end times. So this is finally where we get to the end. But I'm going to argue that this is not only the end, but it is the catharsis of the story. And catharsis is a word that we use sometimes in storytelling that refers to, I'm going to kind of read the definition here, usually refers to the process of arousing negative emotion and tension, then expelling and resolving that emotion, which then leaves the hearers or audience or readers or whatever feeling satisfaction, joy, and peace. Right, so this is what we see in a lot of stories when everything kind of comes together and all the conflict gets resolved. Right, everything is done, solved, it's finished, everything's good to go. It's really common. You see it in movies and books and stories all over the time. And I love catharsis, actually, in storytelling, and I think we all kind of do. It's that kind of fist pump time, when you're watching a movie that just feels good, or the part that gets you to cry or whatever, like feel-good movies. And I realized this, actually, that most of my favorite movies are really good at catharsis. So I'm going to talk about it with, just one of my favorite movies, but a movie called It's a Wonderful Life. I'm sure most of you have seen this. It's a classic, and it's classic because it's great, and it's really good at catharsis. So if you haven't seen it, It's a Wonderful Life. The idea is the story of this guy. He's just a normal guy, right? But he can't really catch a break, right? And so he's always put in these difficult situations where he has to sacrifice what he wants to do for other people around him, right? His family, his friends, people in his town. And so you kind of follow through his life of him making these sacrifices for people. And finally it comes to this breaking point where a lot of money goes missing. And so he's in big trouble, right? Because he's going to take the fall for this money going missing and more than likely go to jail. So he thinks at this point that he's just, down and out. He thinks this idea that it would be better if he was just dead and contemplates killing himself. But this angel shows up and then offers him to show him the world, what it would look like if he had never been born, right? Because that's his wish. It would be better if I was never born. Everything I've ever tried to do has failed, that kind of stuff. So the angel shows him what life is like, and it turns out it's not good, right? His town is kind of not in a good state, right? He's had a very positive impact on everyone around him, and without him, everyone else would be worse off. And so the story kind of that's the climax, right? When he's trying to everything's terrible. And then he realizes, right, oh no, I've had a good impact on the world, And so he learns that one man can make an impact, and we learn that one man can make an impact, right? That's the lesson of what's happening. But that's not the end, right? That's not the catharsis of what's happening. And that doesn't happen until he finally gets back home, and he doesn't care. He's doesn't care if he goes to jail anymore, right? Because he's just happy to be back. But then everybody in the town that he's helped throughout his life comes and gives him the money he needs to pay this debt or whatever, right? So that's when the catharsis happens, right? It resolves every single bit of the story. Every conflict that you could have gets resolved, right? Because we're focused on the main conflict happening, right? Oh, this he thinks he shouldn't have been born, and that gets resolved. But what about this him getting arrested thing, right? That's still hanging. Well, finally that gets resolved at the end, and then the movie ends. And I cry every time I watch this movie, but I used to watch it with my grandma on Christmas Eve. But it's that feeling that everything is solved, right? Every bit of it, everything that conflict turns out better than we could have hoped. There's no problems left. And I feel like Revelation is kind of like that to me. Also, Back to the Future is one of my other favorite movies, and that is a very strong, everything just wraps up real nice in that movie as well. So I apparently just love this in stories. And I would almost argue you kind of have to have this or your story's not finished, but that's just me. And this is kind of how I see Revelation in a way. This is just my thought process, right? This is the end, right? It's the resolution. Everything gets fixed, right? And it's all joy. And that's a weird thing to say about Revelation, right? Because there are some terrifying things that happen, right? There's judgment and destruction and turmoil and tribulation and all of these things. But in all of it, God gets the glory. God gets the glory. God fixes all the problems. Christ judges all that is evil. The Lamb is victorious, and he makes all things new, and all is joy. And so that's kind of how I think the best way to look at Revelation really is. It's the resolution of all things. And so that kind of motivates us too, right? That joy fills us with motivation to like serve God and love people and do what we're called to do and live for that idea. And I think that's important why Jesus says like be aware of the signs and know it's coming, right? Because that's helpful for us to know and be aware and not get taken mark, so we know that we're living with a purpose. There's a kind of a historiography is the study of history and what history is about. And the Christian historiography is the idea that history has a purpose, right? It's going somewhere. It's not Eastern historiography that says everything's circular, right? We don't believe that. That's not true, right? There's an end. There's an eschaton, right? There's a purpose. God will resolve all things. And so we know that, and we have to live like that. And so Revelation is helpful for us in that way, right? There's hope and joy in all of that. And so that's a good resolution, I think, to the story of history.